everybody for being here. Greatly appreciated. So this panel is, I think, really pertinent, especially those of you who just heard Jamal Jimerson talking about issues surrounding systemic racism and the like. And transitioning over to this notion of monuments and museums, which has really, of course, captured a lot of our attention nationwide. You know, ever since the, you know, really precipitated by the events early into our pandemic with, you know, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and some of that that's been building, of course, for years and years, has really come to a moment in sort of this expressions of outrage over public monuments. And, you know, that's gotten a lot of attention, you know, around the country, mostly sort of focused down south, you know, where we've seen a lot of the Confederate memorials actually toppled or removed. And it was such a strange experience. I don't know how many y'all went to AAM back in the before times. The last one was in New Orleans, but, you know, we were in Lee Square. I was staying near Lee Square, and it's like, who's Lee? You know, where's Lee? You know, but they removed the monument there a few years ago. And very often then we find ourselves in New England, though, in this place of complacency, maybe, of just simply, okay, well, we're in New England. We were abolitionists during the build up to the Civil War, and after we were the good guys, right, in this fight for social justice over time. And yet what we experience, you know, even now is this sort of, well, we are forgetting, though, how complicit we actually are in so many ways, individually, structurally, institutionally, and whatever, with ongoing systems of oppression and the like. So the monuments in New England are certainly something that that are in need of investigating. What do these represent to us? What do they mean to our communities? Do they actually reflect systems of oppression and the like? So when Karin and I spoke some time ago about what was going on in Boston in particular, I thought, geez, this would make a terrific case study to sort of understand the process of how a particular place in New England, namely the city of Boston, is grappling with, you know, several of its own fixtures of public art and how they relate to the community. And so Karin has assembled a task force of folks panel today to talk a little bit about that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to kick it over to Karin Goodfellow in a second to kind of introduce her panel and to go through what is going on in Boston, and use that as a springboard for discussion for the rest of us about how does this apply to museums? How do museums act as potentially a repository for these public works of art, which is what some of the locales are really trying to do, is relocate them into a museum. How do we contextualize? How do we store them, maintain them, those kinds of things? So we'll talk a little bit about that, whether they are appropriately part of our institutions and so on after Karin's talk. So with that, I'm going to introduce Karin Goodfellow, who is the head of the Arts Commission in the city of Boston. And Karin, thanks so much for pulling this together and bringing your panel together, and looking forward to the discussion. Take it away.
Thank you, Dan. As we get started, I just want to check in and see that all the panelists are here. Patricia, do you know if Bob and Ekua transitioned from Google Meet to Zoom?
I'm here, Karin.
Oh, you are here. Okay.
And Bob is
and I'm sure Bob is here too. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure. Again, Dan, thank you so much for the introduction, for inviting us to join you and the New England Museum community this morning. We're really thrilled to be here and to be in conversation with you, and we'll stress this along the way, but we really are here for a conversation and to have some shared learning. As we mentioned, my name is Karin Goodfellow. I use the She series as Director of Public Art in the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture. I've worked with artists from all over the city and nation on behalf of the City of Boston with an aim to commission and support innovative and transformative artworks that engage communities, strive to enrich and enliven and decolonize the urban environment, are driven by an artistically strong vision, and enhance the diversity and equity of the existing collection of artworks in the City of Boston. And as part of my work, I act as Director of the Boston Art Commission, which is responsible for the commissioning, acquisition, and maintenance of the art collection owned by the City of Boston. We are also joined by Vice Chair of the BAC, Ekua Holmes, Commissioner Robert Freeman, and Patricia Gilrein, Art Collections Manager. And as we introduce the panel, we'd love if you could help us get a sense of who is in the audience, and if you could please enter into the chat the kind of museum or museum-related work that you do, so just so we can have a sense of who we're in the room with. Ekua Holmes is a native of Roxbury, Massachusetts, and a graduate of the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. As an artist, designer, curator of exhibitions, and most recently as an illustrator of children's literature, she has become a keen observer of her environment and repeatedly chooses it as her subject matter. Voice of Freedom, Fannie Lou Hamer, Spirit of the Civil Rights Movement was released in 2015, featuring illustrations by Holmes in her debut publishing project. In 2016, the book garnered a Caldecott honor, a Cybert, I apologize if I mispronounced that, honor, and a Boston Globe Horn Book Award. In addition, Holmes won the Society of Illustrators Silver Medal and the Coretta Scott King John Steptoe Award for New Talent. Most recently, Out of Wonder, Poems Celebrating Poets, featuring Holmes's illustrations in her second book, received the 2018 Coretta Scott King Illustrator Award, and Stuff of Stars by Marion Dane Bauer garnered a second Coretta Scott King Award for illustration in 2019. Currently, Holmes serves as Assistant Director of Mass Arts Center for Art and Community Partnerships, where she directs Spark, the Artmobile, an art-inspiring, art-transforming vehicle retrofitted to contribute to community-based, multidisciplinary arts programming and pursue a mission to ignite art and design in the neighborhood. She also serves as Vice Chair of the Boston Art Commission, which oversees the selection and care of public art in the city of Boston.
Good morning, everyone.
We are also joined by Bob Freeman. Robert Freeman has been showing nationally for over 30 years as an artist and has been included in the collections of the National Center for African American Artists, Boston Public Library, Brown University, the DeCordova Museum, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, in addition to numerous gallery shows. His paintings have been featured in exhibitions at the DeCordova in Lincoln, Massachusetts, Rose Art Museum at Brandeis University, Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, Williams College Museum of Art in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He earned his BFA and MFA from Boston University. In 1997, he earned Boston University's Distinguished Graduate Award. His teaching experiences include Noble and Greenough School as artist in residence, Harvard University as lecturer and instructor of drawing and painting, and Weston Public Schools as art director. Known for his vivid and powerful figurative paintings, Robert Freeman has traditionally focused on the interactions between people in his work. In couples and crowds, the characters in his paintings betray their emotions with expressive faces and body language. Skillful, brave use of color and gesture are the trademark of Freeman's work.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome to our audience.
And lastly, I'd love to introduce Patricia Gilrein. As an art collections manager working in the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, Patricia is responsible for the physical and intellectual care of the City of Boston's large custody of public art. Such work involves implementing information management systems to retain the history of the Boston Art Commission and promote access to the diverse scope of media to inform future initiatives. Patricia manages appropriate conservation, maintenance, transport, and storage of all works and develops strategies to integrate effective preservation practices. She also administers the Boston Art Commission. Patricia grew up in Western Massachusetts and lives in Jamaica Plain. She has worked with collections of art and design in the US and the UK for nearly 2 decades. For the past 10 years, she has worked with the Boston area museums to lead several large-scale collections relocations, as well as storage, design, and improvement projects. Prior to moving to Boston, she assisted in establishing a physical archive and records management system for Coach in New York City. Patricia graduated from the University of Massachusetts Amherst with a degree in art history and the University of St. Andrews with a master's in museum studies. And before we begin, I will just check in to see that everyone is entering to the chat who they are as well. I know those were really long introductions on our part, but we also want to hear about who you are.
And we're noting, by the way, Karen, we're noting that the chat is, we are in the Zoom land here, but the chat is back over on the Whova platform. So toggle between the two to see what's actually going on.
Okay.
So there we go.
Thank you. And just to give you a little bit of background on the Boston Art Commission, if you're not familiar, The Boston Art Commission, which is staffed by the City of Boston, by the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, is an independent board composed of 2 ex officio people who work for the city and 7 appointed volunteer art and design professionals like Ekua and Bob. And the commission together holds public meetings, generally on a monthly basis, to review and vote on matters concerning the city's art collection. We've been doing those meetings online in recent years, but they're usually held at City Hall, and these are public meetings open with the intention of making sure that all the decisions made about our collection are publicly accessible and open to public comment as well. And just to go over our goals for today, one of the goals of the session today is to share the work that has been happening in the past few years in consideration of monuments in Boston, as well as the public process that was taken to consider 2 very different pieces of public art this summer and fall. We're also really hoping to learn about the current thinking in the museum sector about these matters and what our shared goals are. Memorials that are long known to be symbols that promote white supremacy are being challenged and removed around the world in response to the demands of protesters calling for anti-racism and decolonization. The City of Boston, the Art Commission, which is responsible for the commissioning, acquisition, and maintenance of the art collection owned by the City of Boston, recognize the significant yet often overlooked role public art plays in the city and the need for the collection to reflect our residents and the values of our communities. Unfortunately, and despite ongoing efforts, African Americans, women, Indigenous peoples, local activists, LGBTQIA figures, and many others are missing from the commemorative landscape in our public spaces and have been missing for centuries. Addressing these failures and voids in the city's commemorative landscape is in line with the goals and vision articulated in our curatorial mission, in particular, in the aims of engaging community, enriching and enlivening the urban environment, and enhancing diversity. Examining and interpreting the city's public art collection and addressing inequities that are embedded in some of our monuments and memorials are also directly in line with the city's cultural plan and the city's Resilient Boston Plan for racial equity. As we work to address racism as a public health crisis in the city, it's important to evaluate the role and impact it has on our collection. A truly comprehensive approach to this work of problematic artworks has been to address their complex histories and origins and allowed for members of the public to contribute to their own observations and suggestions of monuments that need recontextualization, additional educational components, or require removal. On this slide, you'll see 2 artworks that have been under consideration. During this presentation, I will discuss their histories and the public process we've taken over the course of this past summer and fall. First, however, we'd like to provide you with some background on our review process from the past few years and how we got to this point. On this slide, you'll see what the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture in Boston, with the Boston Art Commission, has been doing to address those failures and voids in our commemorative landscape. And I'd like to invite Ekua Holmes, who has been with the commission throughout this process and leading us through it, to speak about the work that the commission has been doing to address public art as cultural symbols in public space.
I always forget that. Good morning again, everyone. The first thing I wanted to do is share with you the Boston Art Commission's curatorial vision, which I think is sort of the foundation upon which many of these discussions rest in some ways. The curatorial vision of the BAC is to commission and approve innovative and transformative artworks that engage communities, enrich and enliven the urban environment, and are driven by a clear artistic vision, enhance the diversity of the existing collection, respond directly to a specific environment, and possess durability appropriate to the lifespan of the work. So in 2017, the BAC established a collection policy to ensure that only artworks of the highest quality and enduring value are accepted into and kept in the city's holdings. With the creation of that policy, the BAC also established a deaccession process. Deaccessioning is the formal removal of an artwork from the city's collection after cautious and careful deliberation. And I want to underscore cautious and careful deliberation because, as you know, public art, their landscapes, they're pillars for us as we move about the city. And when you talk about removing something, you're talking about something that's very emotional, as we went through in a past process with the land wave in the South End. While deaccessioning is within the options available, the BAC may instead vote to remove and relocate an artwork to storage or by loan to an institution without deaccessioning the artwork from the city's collection. The BAC may also consider commissioning responsive works from artists or partnering with educators and cultural practitioners to provide public interpretations, events, and learning connections. In 2018, the BAC commissioned an opportunity for change, which Karin described, I think, in an earlier slide. And I think the title says it all, that we're at a point in this country where we have an opportunity to change how we look at monuments and memorials. And I'm very proud that the BAC is sort of on the cutting edge of the kind of processes we have to go through to get there. Passing back to you, Karin.
Yeah. So this is going to give you a little bit sense of that report that Ekua just mentioned, an opportunity for change. As cultural symbols in public space, public art communicates what we value as a city, memorials in particular tell the story of who we are, who we mourn, and who we honor. So in 2018, the Art Commission, as you saw, we had been in the process of creating this curatorial vision, really addressing our collections policy, and we commissioned an opportunity for change. And that was a report on the national dialogue surrounding monuments and its relevance to Boston's public art collection. The goals of the report were to provide a concise summary of the current debate about monuments, or what was the current debate about monuments in the US, including an overview of how other cities have dealt with the issue of contested monuments, and to examine also Boston's commemorative landscape and provide a summary of the objects that are or may become controversial, and to begin a conversation about how to address these issues in Boston. These include small adjustments like changing language found in the online database, proposing additional information, interpretive materials on site, and imagining alternative interventions. On this slide, you see 6 pieces that were called out in the report as, especially worthy of our consideration. You can see the Founders Memorial on the Boston Common, Samuel Eliot Morrison on Comap Mall, in the Fens. In Back Bay, sorry, on the mall. The Francis Parkman Memorial in Jamaica Plain. And we also see Christopher Columbus in here. And the Emancipation Group, which is going to come into conversation as we go forward. But as you see, these are all like fairly different pieces, and the recommendations were really unique on how we should be approaching each of them. And on this next slide, you'll see what the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture has been doing to address those failures in these conversations that we've been having. So continuing the timeline that we were on in 2019, we continued our process to catalog the city's art collection and create a searchable online database with educational content. And we, on June 9th, 2020, which was the beginning of this summer, at the monthly public meeting of the Boston Art Commission, in response to calls for action and accountability after the murder of George Floyd and consequent international removals of monuments, we reviewed a June 1st statement from the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, drafted by our colleagues, and we gave updates on monument removals and vandalism both locally and internationally to the Art Commission at our public meeting. And we also revisited the 2018 report that we just shared with you, and brought up again the task of addressing its recommendations with the intent to develop an actionable steps to approach solutions for the monuments discussed, and those 6 in particular again. And as part of that presentation that I remember making in June, we shared these 2 images. That first one shows Christopher Columbus being vandalized in 2015. And the next one is John Endicott, which is in the Fens by the Museum of Fine Arts, vandalized that day. That was a photo that we took that day. So it was a very live conversation on June 9th. And then we shared that statement from the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture. And Patricia, why don't you share that?
Thanks, Karin. So like Karin had mentioned, this statement was released by the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture on June 1st. This statement was a collaborative effort thanks to Cara Elliott Ortega, Chief of Arts and Culture, Nida Faria, Director of Administration and Finance, and Christina Carroll, Director of Communications. As we work to make Boston a more equitable city, we must be accountable and recognize the way racism is replicated in our own work through the systemic marginalization of Black artists and Black stories in Boston's arts and culture sector. Remaining silent is not an option, and there is no neutral. We urge all of our cultural organizations, institutions, and spaces to consider their role in upholding racist policies and ask that we all recommit to action. Commit to policies that support arts administrators of color and create real opportunities for advancement, hire artists of color with fair pay and treatment, commission works that tell non-white and anti-colonial stories, decentralize Western and European narrative and practices, identify women and minority-owned businesses for local sourcing opportunities, and more. We must put into practice the belief that our fates are linked and truly and honestly move forward together.
Thank you, Tricia. And so we had this meeting where we, really started to, begin this conversation again in earnest. And then that night, the Christopher Columbus statue was vandalized. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see an image showing that the statue, which you had seen before with the red paint on it, just 5 years before. So a statue that we knew was calling attention and asking for consideration was vandalized again, and we weren't, I would say, surprised that it happened, but we were disappointed that we weren't able to have the conversation at the pace and with the intentionality that we had hoped at that point, but it did push us forward. So as we go to this next slide, you'll see again a sense of the timeline that we were working with. So this goes over the public process that we led regarding the consideration of both the Emancipation Group and the Christopher Columbus statue. And so if you see here on June 9th, 10th, we had just had that meeting and the Columbus statue was vandalized. On June 11th, the Columbus statue was removed. And that's what that photo was. That was me at the park at 5 in the morning with conservators and riggers removing the statue. And also on June 11th, a petition by local artist Tori Bullock to remove the Emancipation Group was launched. And that eventually garnered over 12,000 signatures and really started an incredible conversation in the city of Boston about that monument and monuments more generally. And then we started, as you see here, we really were pushed to move forward in our process in a way that we had been heading into, but it really elevated that conversation. On June 23rd, we released surveys, and we'll go over these in more details. And we continued to post things on the website. We created special pages on the Emancipation Group. We had special meetings on the Emancipation Group, two of them. We had one on June 25th and then one on June 30th. And between them, we had around 300 attendees and really important testimony. And then in August, we heard testimony on the Christopher Columbus statue, and again in October. And I'll say again, we had some votes on those as well. And as we've gone over these timelines, you might note that the objectives don't really change again, but our pace does. So if you look at that first, slide we showed, it's like 2016 we did this, 2017 we did this, and the pace we were moving at this summer was much more intense for all of us. And I'm sure Bob, Ekua, and Patricia will have stuff to share about like what that experience was like on our part. And to that end, I think we're going to take a quick break right now, and I'd love if when you get back, you can enter into the chat box whether you feel like your institution is moving too quickly or too slowly to make impactful, genuine structural changes, or if you don't think your organization needs to be making changes, you can share that as well. So we're just going to take 3 minutes to let people stretch and grab some water.
Right, and reminding everybody that the chat is back over in the Whova platform. You guys are in Zoom right now, and so to chat, you need to toggle back and forth, but we are seeing that live.
Karin, do you have access to that?
I do not. Tricia, do you have it open?
Yeah, I have it open, so I can feed you the questions if there are, and responses as well.
Okay.
So let's regather at 11:15. Sorry.
So Karin and crew, I'm looking, first of all, Michelle Abrams, posted a question in the session Q&A, which you might be able to answer fairly quickly. Is there a way we can find the report of the 6 highlighted pieces? It looks fascinating.
Yes, we have the website. We have Public Art Under Review is what it's called, but you could go to boston.gov/art under review and you should be able to find it. I wonder if we can also put that into the conversation. So I guess I can't chat it out, right? But Dan, maybe we can have you share it.
Maybe. Yes. What is it again? Go ahead. I'm going to actually, as you're doing it, I'm in real time. Go ahead. What is it?
Hold on. Let me just double check it. Yep. It's boston.gov.
Oh, wait. Betsy came to my rescue. Betsy Loring, you're one of my great heroes. All right. Betsy just did it. Departments or whatever, art under review. Excellent.
Yeah. So we've been, as we sort of like went over briefly there, and I think we'll go into a little bit more, we've really tried to build up our public conversation on these things. And that has meant both these public meetings and, information on the website. So you can also, if you're curious, find recordings of all these public meetings we had and watch them yourself if anyone is interested.
If you're really going to geek out on this, which I'm sure you do, right, Karin? You've listened to them a few times, I'm sure.
Yeah.
All right, so here are a couple of the comments. In general, it looks as though people are saying that they're moving very slowly, but addressing the issues and so forth. Danielle Amadeo. Danielle, what's your institution? Wait, Northampton Arts Council, maybe. Anyway, Danielle says, thanks for a great first half. Yay, this is halftime. Primary institution is moving too slowly. She works at a college art museum. Students on campus staged a sit-in and a weeks-long demonstration calling for meaningful anti-racism practices 5 years ago. There's been little systemic change within my museum since then. And then she has work in the public sector somehow faces fewer barriers. Northampton's Arts Council has made great strides towards an anti-racist public arts practice, and we're moving at a pace that allows for collaborative input as well as progress. So that's Northampton. And I guess you're somewhat related relative organization. Doug Perkins from Middlebury. Doug says, we're definitely moving too slowly. He's the Middlebury College Museum of Art. On a college campus, this conversation will happen either with us or without us, and we need to put aside excuses such as staffing priorities and make this a priority. Kate Veens, formerly my counterpart here at the, not counterpart, I succeeded her as the NEMA director. Way to go, Kate. You're still with us, that's cool. Kate says, our small local museum seems slowly to be making changes. Part of the challenge is a lack of input from academic historians and scholars working on monuments who have studied the origins of the monuments and the role of historical memory. And as I'm recalling, Kate, you're Attleboro, correct? So I'm assuming you're talking about Attleboro. So slow but sure progress, I think, seems to be the message here, which I don't know how you would characterize your experience in Boston, Karin, but it really looks like it accelerated, like whiplash acceleration starting in June.
Yeah, overnight, and that's
methodically moving along, and then all of a sudden, boom, the
yes,
events took off.
Yeah, and we're really, I mean, we're still in it. I think we've slowed down, and you know, I think Ekua, Bob, and Tricia will talk a little bit about that from their perspective now. But I think you're absolutely right that we had this methodical approach, and you know, we heard from people that they demanded more accountability and more action on our part, and more listening and more conversation, and that was in line with what we said we were doing. We just had to sort of get to it.
Karin, so before we get going, since this is the halftime show, does anybody have any sort of pressing questions or comments or reactions at this point, live and on camera, before we move to the next bit? Anybody's experiencing any community or following up on some of these chat features? No. Well, we need coffee. Yes, Wendy. I knew I could count on you for some.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I've got WOVA open on my iPad next to me, and I've typed in two things. I don't know if you're seeing. So I just thought I'd do a check.
I'm seeing you. Let's see. I'm seeing you in the chat. Yes, I'm seeing the chat anyway.
And so in my chat, it looks like they're just my two comments.
No, you have to, yeah, you know what? I've been using my iPad, throw it out the window. Not worth it. When you're trying to go back and forth, you have to keep renewing or refreshing the screen, I think, Wendy.
Wendy, do you just want to share your comments with us verbally?
Right.
Oh, well, mostly I'm still trying to figure out, you mean about the topic of the session? I don't have any experience in this area at all, so I'm mostly just listening to learn. I'm trying to figure out, I thought I was just asking about
the tech.
Yes.
The tech side. So when my session comes up, I can.
Yeah.
Okay,
the Zoom's on the laptop.
All right, thank you, Wendy. And now I'm seeing, this is very exciting breaking news. I see a raised hand from Nina Zaneri of the Paul Revere Memorial Association. Nina.
Oh. Hi, Nina.
Go for
Hello.
it. Now, hold it. You can talk, right? Can I hear you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Nina, go for it.
Yes? All right, I'm trying to, am I unmuted?
Yeah, you are.
Perfect. I just wanted to say, as someone who has watched this play out in Boston, a real tip of the hat to the Arts Commission for both doing a very thoughtful process, but also responding quickly. In the North End, the Columbus statue has been both beloved and decapitated many times. And I think it's been a really thoughtful process. And I've worked with Karin on a number of things over the years. And I just wanted to say that I think it's been a really good and thoughtful process in Boston.
Thanks, Nina.
Thank you, Nina. And Nina was instrumental in our recent work with Ann Hirsch and Jeremy Andrews of North Square Stories.
Beautiful project.
Yeah.
Also nice, really nice to hear, because there's so many people that think that that we've gone way too slowly with this process, and it does take time if we really want to hear from all of the people involved, and certainly with public testimony. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay, Karin, back to you.
Do you want to go to the next slide, Trisha? Ekua, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say that, just responding to Nina, and thank you also for making that comment, that we've all had to grow thicker skins on the commission, because these are very emotional conversations that we're having. People have very strong opinions, and sometimes it becomes personal. We've been called liars and supporters of vandalism and many things through some of the letters and comments. And but we have to stay grounded in the work. So it's really, we really appreciate having someone sort of know how complicated doing something like this is, and how there is really no one right answer, because there are so many perspectives, and learning how to juggle that and come up with decisions that really serve all of the citizens of Boston is quite a challenge. So I just wanted to bring that up. And in addition to that, we're all volunteers, you know, with jobs and art practices and things like that. So early on in my tenure on the commission, it was one meeting a month, and, you know, very pleasant. Maybe we had 5 people in the room, maybe 10 on a good day. This year, due to probably the technological reach of Zoom, and also the passionate responses to the Columbus vandalism and the emancipation, you know, stimulated, as Karin said, by Tory Bullock's signatures, we've had 97 people in the room who want to be heard, who have valid responses and things to say. And so we've had to grow, and I'm thankful for it. It also has given us an opportunity to dig deeper into the history of monuments in Boston. There's so much that I did not know about the Christopher Columbus statue, did not know about what it meant to the Italian-American community, did not know how passionate the indigenous community was about its removal, did not know the story of the Emancipation Group. So even though we're sitting on the commission, we still have a lot to learn as well that will help us make more informed decisions and more informed questions. Because if you don't start with a good question, you can't get to a good answer.
Thanks, Ekua. Coming up next, we're going to just give you a little bit more information about the process we went through with each of the statues. So we're going to go over the Emancipation Group, and then Christopher Columbus, and then we're going to have more discussion. So first, on the Emancipation Group, we'll provide you a little bit of background for those of you who might not be familiar with the sculpture itself, and our process to date, and ways to engage in this public process moving forward. As I mentioned, it is still ongoing. The Emancipation Group has been criticized since its installation, primarily for its visual representation of Archer Alexander as the passive recipient of Lincoln's gift of freedom. Many also feel that it inaccurately implies that one person is solely responsible for ending slavery, presenting Lincoln as a paternalistic white savior and obscuring his complex history. The Boston Art Commission received repeated calls for its removals over many, many years, and including that recent petition that garnered, over 12,000 signatures. And I'd like to invite Commissioner Freeman to speak a bit about being at the forefront of this process and to share a little bit about the testimony we received.
Yeah, thanks, Karin. I wanted to speak just a little bit about the testimony. There were 46 people who testified, and as Karin had said, over 90 people wanted to testify. We had over 645 people respond to our email within the mailing process. We spent about 3 hours in each of the public testimonies. And I went over a couple of days ago some of the testimonies that I had jotted down, and I'd like to share a few of those with you. I only have 12 out of the 46, but Barry Gaither, who is on our Recontextualization Subcommittee, he had a wonderful testimony, and here are a few words that that he gave us. Nothing in the memorial indicates that Black soldiers gave their lives to freedom. Frederick Douglass objected to the statue, both Lincoln and slave. This statue has to come down. Jahan Bowden said, this needs to be taught. Keep it in the people's faces. Keep it for the public so that they can learn the truth. Obviously, he was in the camp of keeping the statue and recontextualizing the text. Carrie Turner, I hate it. It represents white supremacy. And as she went through this, she was very emotional. Isaac Plovich, made me cringe, he said. Looks like Lincoln had a slave. I hated it. Byron Russian was in support of keeping the statue, but again, recontextualizing the text around it. The statue should stay. Increase public interpretation, tell the history. Kevin Tucker, the statue suffered from being able to view it from a bad angle. He said it should be viewed from simply a different angle so that we'll make a different interpretation of it. Holly Tarnover, the statue of a white savior. It is demeaning eyesore and should be relocated to a museum. Reverend Culpepper, statue must come down. Let's see, Greg Utz maintains social order. Inferior on its knees. The model is not of a freed slave. Tory Bullock, who you heard garnered 12,000 signatures, said, I respect the work's artistry, but it does not belong in the public sector. This slave will always be frozen and never able to stand up on his own. Sonia Harris, pictures tell stories. This story is one of regression, not progress. Who is telling the story? Sarah Ting, preserve our history. Do not take the statue down. And I might say that we heard an awful lot from people that said, this is our history. We need to preserve our history. Frida Ed, children do not understand the meaning of this statue. Only the kneeling slave stays in their mind. So those are just a few of the public testimony. Again, we spent 3 hours and we heard over 46 people, each time almost 90 people in the room. Many people were unable to give testimony, but wanted to. And as Karin said, we wanted to build up and still do. We want to build up the conversation and hope that you all will contribute to the conversation. Karin, did you want me to talk about the subcommittee now, or shall we do that later?
I think we'll do that on another slide.
Okay.
Thank you. Patricia, do you want to give just a brief explanation of what we did on the website, which people might be visiting?
Yeah, sure. So I know there was a question about this website, and here's a visual representation of that you can access the report that we were speaking about. Thank you, Commissioner Freeman, for adding the verbal testimony we received. We also created a survey and a web presence, and we created that to get feedback from the public and provide background on the artwork. We asked respondents to tell us which options they recommend, as well as rank them in order of benefit to the city. So we offered a lot of options to people to weigh in on and choose. Some of those options were to provide additional education and information at the current site, commission a new work of art, whether that be permanent or temporary, to exist in dialogue with the Emancipation Group, partner with educational organizations to provide events, relocate the statue to a new site, such as a museum, remove the statue entirely from public view, and formally remove it from the city's collection, and then commission a new artwork, permanent or temporary, that would replace the existing statue. And we also offered an option to write in recommendations. The conversations that came out of this public dialogue guided decisions around our art collection. They also helped us better understand our histories and how to move forward.
And Ekua, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. Going to the next slide, you'll see numbers of respondents to the survey, the call for written testimony, and the number of individuals who offered testimony at the June 25th and June 30th meeting. As we mentioned earlier, we've been holding this meeting virtually, which is, I hope that this is going to continue to allow more citizens of Boston to participate in the process. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the top two choices were commission a new work of art after removing the statue. And I believe it's relocate the statue to a new site. That those blues are very, yes, and remove the statue entirely from public view and remove it formally from the city's collection. I did want to mention here, I've heard a lot of people talk about the African-American community in response to the Emancipation Group. And I just wanted to say that it was a very diverse group of people who felt that this statue needed to be removed from public view. It wasn't just the Black community, it was all kinds of folks that participated. And I think one of the things that we're interested in as a body is, in terms of dealing with all the different voices, is not sort of fracturing ourselves along racial and ethnic lines, but just as a city, how do we want to be represented? Is that my phone? I'm so sorry. Could have sworn I turned it off, and I did. So over 160 letters with about 75% favoring removal. And so these are the kinds of things that we took into consideration before we took our final vote.
Thanks, Ekua. And as has sort of been indicated, by the testimony Bob shared with you, while many people came into the conversation focused on whether to take the statue down or leave it up, we've also found that much of the verbal and written testimonies were far more nuanced on that. And some really asked us to keep looking at our existing collection and highlight pieces, that we're doing a better job telling the stories, in particular of African Americans, and the story about their agency in working, thank you, to abolish slavery. And these are two pieces that are in the same park in Boston South End, Spirit of Emancipation by Meta Warwick Fuller, and Step on Board by Fern Cunningham. And these are both in Tubman Square Park in the South End, and they are in conversation with each other. And this takes us back to the conversation about our collection and how do we tell our story.
I just want to add one thing to that. It's worth noting that both of them are women artists, women sculptors. And Fern was the first that the city of Boston engaged. Yeah, not that the city of Boston engaged, but Harriet Tubman was the first woman.
Yeah, that we honored in a memorial.
And what was the date of Step on Board? Was that more or less?
Yeah, it was, we were just like, realizing we didn't have that right before we came in here. I think it was the 90s, I think. Tricia will, can you check on that? She'll let us know. But Fern Cunningham, who is an incredible artist who has really done more, I think, than any single person, artisan for sure, to like tell, stories of women, of people of color, of the Black community in Boston in particular. She passed away this summer, and we're still working on her final project in Roxbury Nubian Square for the Justice Gordine Park. And so we are very grateful for her contributions. And so that's another one of the narratives we are hoping to uplift more in our storytelling of the artists who have made real change to our commemorative landscape.
It was 1999, just so you know. Somehow my phone is connected to my computer, and I apologize. I don't know how to undo that.
This is a Zoom era, Ekua. Don't sweat it.
Okay.
And so if we go to the next slide, finally, we'll just, go over that the unanimous vote that the Art Commission ended up taking at a public meeting after having all these conversations. So pending the engagement of an art conservator to document, recommend how the bronze statue is removed and supervise its removal and placement into temporary storage, we would move into the commissioning of detailed documentation of the artwork into the Boston Art Commission archives, which may include photography of the statue in sight, drawings in a 3D scan, as well as the history of the piece and the process that we went through, and also the creation of public events to acknowledge the statue's history and inform the public, the initiation of a process to determine how to recontextualize the existing statue in a new publicly accessible setting, and the addition of temporary signage to the site to interpret the statue prior to its removal, and permanent signage after the removal. Pending all of that, the statue would be removed and put in temporary storage. And I'll say that we have engaged a conservator on that, and the process is ongoing, and we are looking toward removal and temporary storage. And I will go to the next slide. On this slide, you'll see the feedback form that is on our webpage regarding the history and future of the Emancipation Group. And I'd also like to ask Commissioner Freeman to speak about his work on the Recontextualization Subcommittee. Bob, do you want to talk a little bit about your work on the Recontextualization Subcommittee?
I was muted.
Oh, okay.
I just talked an awful lot about it. We thought it was really important to have a subcommittee who would take a look at the Emancipation Group after it was taken down, and also what would be done with the area in Park Square. We were fortunate to have Kira Singleton join our group from the Royal House and Slave Quarters, Dr. Kimberly Pinder from Mass, she is the acting president of Mass College of Art, Representative Byron Rushing, who is a past legislator, Barry Gaither, who is the director of the National Center of African American Artists, Marita Rivero, past director of the Museum of African American History, Camilo Alvarez, who is a Boston Art Commissioner, and Nikki Green, who is an associate professor at Wellesley College. We've met twice, and these are people who like to talk, and so we have our meetings on Friday afternoons for 1 hour, and we've talked about a number of subjects. First, we've talked about where should the statue go. Whether it stays in Boston, should it go to a museum, should it go to a library, or should it stay in storage? Again, the conversation is ongoing. What should happen to the area around the statue once the statue is gone? There's been conversations that talked about having art festivals that talk about freedom. There's conversations about commissioning artists to build new statues. So again, the conversations are ongoing. Part of the problem that I think everyone sees is that if we choose a public space, such as a museum or as a library to place this, the young child, say a 10-year-old child, who doesn't understand the recontextualization text, only sees the image of a white man with his hand over a kneeling black slave. I remember in the public testimony, I was really moved by two women, two mothers, who said, and they've changed my mind about how we should proceed. They said, I took my son to see the Memorial Emancipation Group, and he said, that looked like Daddy. And the other mother, who wept while she gave her testimony, said that her son said, that looks like me. And it reminded me that the power of the image is sometimes greater than the power of the word. So this is the conversations that we're having in our subcommittee. Again, we've only met twice, and those conversations are going to be ongoing. It has been recommended, and Karin came up with I thought, a terrific recommendation, that if it has to stay in, if the statute has to stay in storage, that it be accessible for archives and educators to visit the statute. And if it goes into a public area, like a museum or a library, that perhaps it be some kind of restricted area where young people won't be influenced so much by the image itself. So, so those are the conversations we're having. These are the conversations that I'd love to hear from you about in chat. Would love recommendations that I can bring back to the subcommittee. And again, thank you for letting me tell you a little bit about the subcommittee.
Thanks, Dan. And I think with that, we'll take another quick break. And as Bob asked, please do share if you have ideas. We have this form online that we'd love you to submit to if you would like, but also just enter into the chat. We're here for conversation. This is like live things we're struggling with and talking about. If you have ideas, please come out with them. And so let's gather at 47 past, if that's okay.
Okay, cool. So reminding everybody, we've got the chat in Whova, and anybody that's hanging in here during this break that you want to throw a question out live and you don't want to flee the scene here, let me hear it. What are you thinking? And we can sort of redirect.
Dan?
Yeah. Hey, John, how you doing?
Good. Just to save myself from typing, I'll just make a verbal comment. But John Ravenel, and I just want to say this is really fascinating and thoughtful and impressive process. I'm really interested to hear about it. And also, just to be addressing these controversial works in Boston in a setting that maybe one wouldn't initially have thought was a arena for controversial sculpture, which Dan, you mentioned at the beginning. We tend to have a kind of default sense of that being a Southern problem, for instance. And the one thing I would just add to the conversation is just the notion of evolution of, and Robert Freeman, you were basically just talking about this in part, a kind of evolution of one's own thinking or of a community's thinking in response to these works. And I really feel personally I can identify with that, or I've seen that happen. I lived in Richmond for 17 years before moving up here 5 or 6 years ago. And so I still use that as a kind of touchstone with Monument Avenue. And, I was very in support of the idea of recontextualization for many years there, which seemed like a really intelligent, elegant solution. But over the past half a year, since the real active Black Lives Matter protests and really active in Richmond, I came to understand that was unfortunately, as well intentioned as it was, ended up being just a kind of a stalling tactic, and also ended up trying to find that illusory neutral position. As if there were a kind of neutral position, that's sort of like both sides position. And it took watching the kind of vehemence and the communal activity of actually seeing statues pulled down, of seeing Jefferson Davis just pulled off of his pedestal and Columbus pulled down off of Monument Ave and another part of the park and rolled into a pond nearby, to start to understand the depth of the reaction. And then also seeing, the last thing I'll say is just seeing the Robert E. Lee monument, which is actually the only one left standing now, except for Arthur Ashe, of course, farther up Monument Ave. But of the Confederate generals, it's the one left standing. But seeing the what became a monument in itself, the kind of communal expression of graffiti and projection on that enormous pedestal. So I've seen my own perspective evolve dramatically based on the changing context just over the past half a year.
Yeah, good point, John.
Yeah, thank you, Ken.
Hey, Ken.
Hey, I put something in the chat. A good example, if you're looking at how to interpret monuments that we're taking off view, is at the University of Texas at Austin, where they took off some of their statues and interpret them. And so there's one example. And if you don't know, the current issue of History News has a really great article on monuments and memory. I brought one of the speakers to Historic New England on monuments. I think it's available on our website. Ashley was absolutely amazing. Ashley Lawrence Sanders. She has a new book that's going to be coming out in the next year or so. So those are just some great resources. I believe the Monuments and Memory talk that she did along with Esteban Raul Galvez and W. Todd Gross is available on the AASLH website. I thought it was amazing. Last comment is I've been talking with David, who's the director of the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Art and Ephemera at the Ferris State University. I'm going to have him speak for Historic New England the first week in March. Date's not set, but he's a firm believer in using these kinds of materials to teach and having them on view. So if you haven't looked at that website, I also suggest you take a look at that. David speaks a lot, and there's quite a few interviews and things with him on that website.
Ken, what was the website? Is that AASLH or is that Ferris State?
For David at the Jim Crow, you just go to their website, the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Art and Ephemera at Ferris State University. A lot of good information there, and just watch our website. He'll be speaking the first week in March.
You know, what's interesting is, and Karin, do you mind if we sort of keep the discussion going for just a second?
Yeah, we're just so you know, we're just going to give you a very brief explanation of what happened with Columbus, and then we're moving right into discussion anyway, so we can just break that up.
So the thing that's interesting about this whole notion of recontextualization that John mentioned, and just a point of clarification, down in Richmond, John, the recontextualization was with the memorials staying in place in C2, right? That they were being reinterpreted but staying in place. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Yeah, and it's, you know, it's fascinating because, you know, I mean, I'm reflecting on the notion of what these memorials are and where they fit in terms of you know, are they art or are they propaganda? I mean, in some senses, all art is somewhat propaganda, you know, the position of an artist. But, you know, it's like, okay, what, back in 1879, what was the purpose of putting a copy of a statue that was in Washington, D.C. in Boston? Well, clearly that was some kind of propaganda. Anytime you copy something, you know, you're making a statement that this artwork is worth putting here for a particular reason. And so, you know, my thoughts go to, you know, how do you recontextualize this and in what manner, if they're artwork or if they're, you know, making some kind of a statement at a particular time? And what's the difference between this and the Glory Monument, for example, you know, on the public art or on the common, you know, I mean, all of these sort of elements of what are we saying with this, and they reflect a community at a particular point.
Yeah. Yeah. So the 54th Regiment, in Colonel Shaw Memorial, also just very artistically different. The Thomas Ball piece, Emancipation Group, being a recasting, as you said, and now we're going to talk about Columbus, which also is, you know, artistically very different and just very different as an object. And we'll talk about how that changed the way we manage this conversation. So I'll hand it over to Tricia to go over that briefly.
Thanks, Karin. So I wanted to provide a little bit of background on the statue itself. It was located, before it was removed, in Christopher Columbus Park. Originally, it was installed as an Italian-American cultural symbol in 1979. According to Boston Art Commission minutes from shortly after its installation, the statue was never reviewed at a BAC meeting or accepted into the BAC's care or ownership. The sculpture was most recently vandalized on June 10, 2020. History of vandalism includes incidents in 2004, 2006, 2015, and 2018. Following the most recent case, the statue was removed from its pedestal and placed in storage. At the August meeting of the BAC, the Commission heard testimony from the public in attendance regarding a possible review and study of the Christopher Columbus statue. At the end of that meeting, the BAC voted to initiate a process to study the future of the statue. So similar to the Emancipation Group, the Commission received public testimony following the removal of the statue. And this slide describes the ways in which we received that testimony both in written form and during the public meetings. During the August and September meeting, we heard verbal testimony from 17 individuals. And at this point, I can throw it over a bit to Commissioner Holmes and Commissioner Freeman if they would like to speak briefly about how this experience with the Christopher Columbus statue differed from the Emancipation Group.
I'll simply begin by saying that that the two groups, the Indigenous people and people in support of Indigenous people, were quite at odds with the Italian community, and we received some very difficult testimony from both communities, both written and verbally.
Yeah,
Can I add to that?
Yeah, I think that, you know, one of the things that made this so different from the Emancipation Group is that there were clear communities that were at odds with one another. And not only that, but interpretations of the history of this individual. There were some people who clearly saw Christopher Columbus as just a genocidist, a racist, a murderer, without any redeeming value. And then at the extreme opposite, some people who saw him almost as a saint. And none of them, I shouldn't say none of them, but many of them were not able to pause for a moment to consider a different perspective. And so it made it very, very difficult testimonies to listen to. In contrast to the Emancipation Group, which I think was more about who we see ourselves as right now and what values we want to promote in the public space. As someone said at one of the meetings, you know, the streets are a classroom. And so our children are constantly learning from the things about the things that we value by what we put in the public space. I don't feel that with Christopher Columbus, we reached a place where the two sides sort of came together into a middle ground at all. I think it's still very polarizing. You brought up whether or not this piece is actually a work of art to come under the purview of the Boston Art Commission, which is also a question that we had. And I think that each case taken on its own merit I think each case is going to be its own adventure for the Boston Art Commission as we go through this series, the 6 pieces and maybe beyond. It's going to be a different adventure for the city, for professionals like yourself looking at these issues. There just is no blanket way of dealing with everything. So, and just to the last point that I see here about there are still so many histories that have not been exposed at all, and how as a commissioning body now with some funding opportunities, we are able to enhance the diversity of the City of Boston's collection through commissioning new work. And so that's an exciting prospect going forward.
Yeah, so thank you, Ekua, and thank you, Bob, for sharing. As they said, this was a very different conversation. Columbus acts as a symbol in a very different way and has a lot of meaning to people. But it was also very different because it had sort of come to the forefront of our conversation because of the vandalism, and it was removed because of that vandalism. Mm-hmm. And so the recommendations that, you know, we as staff gave the commission were really focused on the object, and really coming out of, we had 2 conservators' reports that spoke to the fact that the statue wasn't going to be durable and it wouldn't be able to withstand the kind of vandalism it was seeing. And so the recommendations we made were to repair the statue and to replace it would not be recommended, and that we would recommend the transferal to storage or a private interior location where it can be interpreted and removed from risk of further damage. And this has not been determined finally in terms of legal agreements, but we have received, the mayor has received written interest from the Knights of Columbus in the North End to to display the statue on site in an interior location, and conversations about that are ongoing. And we have deferred that to our city corporation council because, as we said, we never voted this into our collection as well. So it was a very different conversation, but we did say we're not going to be removing the pedestal, but that we would think that it should get some interpretive signage. And we also expect an ongoing conversation around the park's name and a greater conversation in the city around these issues, although we know that we focused on the object. And additionally, when we made recommendations and the commission took a vote, we thought about what else is important, and then we determined that we would have special meetings with the commission to discuss the complex review of cultural symbols on public land and the desire for artwork that honors the experience and histories of the people of Boston. And we also talked about commissioning new works, commissioning a new artwork with the North End and Italian American communities in a proximate site. And also to commission new artwork with Indigenous communities in a site to be determined. And so those all happened at the meeting where we voted. And later on, we had an announcement of a special meeting that we'll be holding in January on Indigenous public art and cultural spaces in Boston. And so we also wanted to sort of separate those conversations a little bit because they had become so adversarial, and that didn't seem necessary or desirable for this conversation to go forward to honor I think the meaning that public art had for each community. Could we not come up with a perfect compromise or a neutral agreement, but could we listen to people in what they wanted and how they wanted to be seen and represented as members of the community in terms of their histories and culture? And so in that, I know we're getting short on time, but very briefly, Tricia, if you want to share a little bit about our ongoing process with the sort of slow and steady work we were doing before we started all these public meetings.
Yeah, thanks, Karin. So part of this process and kind of identifying gaps in the collection and working on equity work within kind of the commissioning process, an important component of that has been the building of a collections database. This, I mean, people in this conference right now are probably very familiar with collections databases as they relate to museum work. So this is something that we're implementing for the city, and it's been a process that has started in 2019. And while we had a very busy summer, we're still very much on track to implement this database, since it really is a very important component of our work. We selected the museum system, which is pretty much known as TMS in the field by Gallery Systems, to create the first database. I'm currently working with a data coordinator to build data sets. In anticipation of that implementation, our work will result in an internal and external searchable database of the entire collection. Each artwork in the city will be represented by a record file with comprehensive information, including photographs. Ours is a constantly changing collection, so we will keep adding and revising this data. We'll also have an e-museum component that shares images of artwork in their locations on a publicly accessible map on the city's website. You can see on this slide an example of what we hope to implement very soon, hopefully by the spring. This is Seattle's collection built by the selected vendor TMS. Each link will directly go to the record for each artwork. So that's very exciting, and we hope that you come back to our website in the spring to see everything that we hope to share.
And then finally, we talked about how these were such unique projects and processes that we went through, but we still felt like we needed to develop some kind of at least starting process to think about like how we can approach these conversations. So on this slide, you'll see a chart establishing a review process for all artworks as a group to support the city's equity goals. So, going over like the policy alignment sort of across, we talked about our curatorial vision and, our collection policy. So really trying to keep in line with all of that and be intentional and transparent. So starting with condition assessment to research and documentation, outreach and education, and testimony and dialogue, which will always be a big part of what we do, and then moving into action steps. And I think, we're a little bit short on time. We're going to have a short break here, but I think, we can, if you'd like to do that, please do get up and stretch. But also you can just let us know some questions you have. And I think I have some questions for the panel, and then we can also invite you to enter into conversation as we're going as well in the, I think, 12 minutes we have left.
Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon.
So,
yeah, thanks, Karin. Why don't we just, spend a couple of minutes then, if you all want to take a break, that's fine. But like Karin said, we have 10 or 12 minutes left. I'm very curious to, what strikes me is the nexus between this, between public art and museums in particular. And, one of the things that I'm very fascinated about is just, how do we feel about this notion that, museums are in fact a potential solution to these public art issues. Nina, I see you raising your hand desperately, waving it. Go ahead.
You're waving it. I wanted to bring up something about the Columbus statue. There are donor names on the base, which is why I think the base is still there. To what extent, not particularly just with Columbus, but with any public art, do the donors' intentions get taken into the decisions about what to do?
I think it would, depend on the case and what the agreements were at the time. Certainly when we're doing new works, for example, where, we're looking at that with the King Memorial on the Common, the Embrace, and working very closely on the commissioning of that piece, which is being privately funded and so donated. And so in that case, it's, we're having agreements and really formally developing the paperwork. I'll say though, with Columbus, we didn't have any of that. And the reason for keeping the pedestal was, it was about donors, but it was also about community meaning and representation for people who remembered their parents and their grandparents being engaged there and trying to represent the Italian American community in the park.
Well, it's a great point, Nina, because, in some case, well, thinking about okay, is the city, and any city, if is that matter, is that the equivalent of a museum? Do you have an intake process? You have donors, you have donor agreements and those types of things. And yet, it's so, well, as many of you know, I grew up in St. Louis, and my city art museum is literally a city-owned institution. And so, the notion that the city and I don't know if this is in fact happening in St. Louis, but you know, if there is a public monument that somebody says, well, let's put it into a museum, it's effectively saying we're going to continue to have it in the public sphere, public ownership or whatever. And this is a little bit different. What we're talking about in Boston, of course, presumably, is that it's you know, the idea that a private institution is going to take over where the public are, you know, the public sector left off, and somehow that's going to magically transform this piece into being, you know, less objectionable to the public, and or have some kind of a magical spell cast upon it where it no longer does any harm. I mean, joking, because I'm looking at Bob Freeman there, what he just said about it actually being, you know, who cares? It's still going to be an object that's going to raise, you know, a lot of emotions in folks. So I'm interested in hearing some of our museum folks thinking about that. What I mean, is this piece, for example, should this be in a museum in your estimation? Come on, you have no opinions, Danielle. I see you. All right.
It depends on the collections within museums. Like, it's not just for any museum, right? But if certain museums have a muscle for talking about problematic objects, many of us do not. Many of us have just as controversial, just as problematic, just as contentious objects within our collection that we don't have a muscle for talking about yet. Mm-hmm. So I think it depends on what else is in the collection that something like a Columbus statue could be in conversation with. And it depends on the museum's ability to stage those conversations. It depends on the audience and whether they want to show up for those conversations. I don't think it's just a Band-Aid fix.
Mm-hmm.
And let's not forget, it costs money.
Well, so there,
those.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge thing, right? I mean, I don't know if y'all are deeply reading about this, but the Mellon Foundation has created some kind of a program to actually support this type of thing. I don't know exactly what the details are. Maybe some of you that are actually more boots on the ground on this know, but yeah, I mean, you know, thinking about what the maintenance would look like of something like this and the storage and the, you know, whatever. I mean, does the city propose that there's, you know, actually some a maintenance fund or something that can be put towards this if it were to wind up in a museum? The answer is no in the case of Boston, from what I understand. But is that something that you would demand as a museum? If you were going to take this, you would need to have some kind of funding for it.
I would say the answer, though, isn't no for us. I think we're figuring it out as we go. So again, as you might imagine, to even do the work we've done with removals, we've had to adjust budgets, postpone other projects. So I think, you know, we're looking for solutions and then sort of looking about the ways to get there, looking for the solutions first, and then sort of going through the process of figuring it out and what that might look like.
Bernard, I'm going to be very unfair, but you, Bernard Fishman of the Maine State Museum, I'm interested in hearing you, you know, as sort of this public museum. Is there anything going on up in Maine that's equivalent, or how do you feel about it as a, you know, public sector museum with this sort of transference of objects like this?
Well, thanks, Dan, for calling on me, but yes, but not to this degree. We had a controversy 7 years ago or so over a series of painted murals depicting labor scenes. It became controversial because the governor of Maine at that moment decided that those, in my opinion, really very innocent and sweet sort of representations of labor disputes in the most mild way you could imagine constituted North Korean-like propaganda, and had them removed from display and then actually hidden for years until a court case determined that the governor had the right to remove them from a public space, and the Maine State Museum stepped in to display them and solve the crisis. So they remain on display. They have a fairly good quality of art in themselves, in my opinion, which helps. The way they present the disputes is historically valid, I think, and not terribly inflammatory. And we assisted that display by creating a kiosk of additional information that visitors could examine and get a great deal more information about the individual scenes. There are 11 of these. But in the case of more interesting controversies than this particular one, though by main standards this was fairly heated, I think museums are probably not good places to display them because they can, for all the reasons that were said, the cost of the maintenance, the combustibility of the argument. I'm reminded of what happened in the ancient world. Very often these great temple complexes would receive many votive statues. And after a couple of centuries, there were too many of them to display. So what they would do, this happened in Egypt many times, they would dig huge pits within the sacred precincts and bury the statues there. Mm-hmm. And that way they kept, we might say, supporting their metaphysical function, but they cleared the space. I would not actually recommend that the statues be buried, though I don't think that should be excluded. But that's something of the equivalent to be sought. I don't see how the Abraham Lincoln statue could be redeemed, to use that word, in any conceivable way that would be useful. And I think that it should probably just, frankly, cease to be.
It's interesting because that idea is similar to, what is it, the post-Stalinist art graveyards in Russia, I think it was, that I'm reading. But the idea that, you know, the works that have become disdained in the particular culture were not destroyed, but put into the graveyard where people could actually still visit if they felt so inclined to kind of learn about it, but it wasn't in the public sphere any longer.
I'll mention just again the ancient world, which provides so many parallels for a great deal of what's happening now. When paganism was supplanted by Christianity, those pagan statues and their temples were generally destroyed. But there were some great works of art that were brought to Constantinople by Christian emperors who recognized their artistic value and displayed them publicly. As long as the public of that time understood their value, they remained out in the public, I suppose, well taken care of, more or less, and visible. But when the Crusaders conquered Constantinople, they destroyed most of these statues, even though they were of the same religion, because they no longer supported what they represented, but more to the point, they were opportunities for cashing in. Very famous bronze statue was melted down for coinage. And then the Crusaders went on to ransack the tombs of the Byzantine emperors and haul their corpses out and strip them. So there's something to be said for the point that if the public doesn't support in some way the continued public display of these statues, nothing can save them.
That's a good point. So the hourglass is running out here. 2 minutes. Somebody is, who did I hear shout?
Yeah, Dan, Pat Morse here.
Oh,
yeah, you are correct that there is a museum we visited a year ago, and I forget if it was in the suburbs of Moscow or St. Petersburg, but there's a modern art museum. Mm-hmm. And then outside it, to the side, was a small courtyard with just a whole pile of Stalin-era statues right next to each other. And then some of the more formidable ones have been incorporated into a park that with paths that you can walk through and see them with interpretive messages. So yes, that is true.
Interesting. Where's the real estate in Boston for that? I don't know. We might.
You also don't want these bad statues hanging around to be revivified.
Yeah.
You know, when the fascists come back into power and they have these statues available,
that's true.
Bring them back. So I really do think that if we feel we've moved on from them, obviously with some exceptions, I don't think destruction is an alternative that should be ruled out.
It's cultural exorcism or something. Well, you know, all right, our time is upon us here, and I want to thank the folks that presented for us, Karin and Patricia and Ekua and Bob. Thank you so much for your background in getting us some context into this issue. You know, what I'm realizing is that, you know, this is maybe the tip of the iceberg for us in a conversation of our NEMA community on this, and it might be something that I'll mention to the staff about maybe doing a workshop or something later on this winter, just to, you know, have a online thing to continue the conversation, because it sounds like some of us are starting to contemplate some of this or have been contemplating it in our communities. And it's perhaps something that we can maybe continue the conversation a bit, you know, some of these bigger issues about how do we solve it and how do we pass these things on. So thank you. Karin, do you have any parting words for everyone?
Just thank you for being here. When we started out, I was curious to see how many of you would still be here when we finish, and I'm so impressed and flattered that you've all stayed. And I just want to thank Dan again and everyone at NEMA, and also Patricia, Bob, and Ekua for being here today and sharing, but also obviously everything that we've been working on together over these last months.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? And I
long road ahead.
Thank you all for having us. We really
Thank
appreciate
you, everybody.
it.
Take
All
care.
right.
We'll see you soon. Bye.